Okay. Now what we have, if we're looking at this, and I want you to be taking down some notes on this as well, is this is the basic social structure for Rome. And it is a lot more complex than what it looks. Because when we look at this social structure in Rome, we've got obviously the Senate at the top here being the key group. That is the government. The Senate, for most of our period that we're looking at, is made up of 600 people. 600 people. Take some notes down on this, people. 600 people. Now, to be a senator, you actually have to be from a particular group of people. Now, there was some social mobility. You could actually rise your way up. You could rise your way up, but there's some conditions. To be a senator, you had to have a certain amount of money. There was like a minimum amount of money to actually be a senator. If you didn't have that much money, and you were a senator, you'd actually lose your position. They'd actually put you out of the Senate. But the more complicated thing was, that amount of money you had to be based on traditional ways of raising money for the senatorial class, which was just through being a pastoralist, owning lands, owning farms, things like that. It was considered to be beneath a senator to be a business person. So you weren't allowed to have the amount, you weren't allowed to be a senator and a business person at the same time. So you couldn't have, like little trading companies and businesses, etc. That doesn't mean they didn't. In fact, one of the richest people in Rome was a guy called Crassus, Marcus Licinius Crassus. And Crassus was wealthy based on trade. But what he did was he had lots of proxies. So he had lots of little companies that he owned, but none of them would be his name. He'd have a lot of his freedmen, which were like ex-slaves that he'd freed. He'd free these slaves, put them to the head of these companies, and all the money would go to him, etc. But technically he's not actually breaking the law. So there were grey areas in it. Now, that senatorial class, they were considered to be the, obviously the most important class, and being a senatorial rank was a really distinguishing thing in Rome. The group below here, the equestrian class, is actually much more about economics. So trade and economics was what they dealt with. They were a really important class. So technically, this group here, the equestrian class, a lot of them are much richer than even the senatorial class.
Why is it called equestrian class?
Well, you want to know where the equestrian, what's that got to do with it? Yeah, it's got to do with horses. Because in the olden days of Rome, because we're talking 1st century BC, but we go back another 100 years before that, those Romans who were in the Roman army who could actually buy their own horse, have enough money to actually buy their public horse to use in the Roman army, were given this rank of equestrian class. So really to be part of that, you sort of had to be like the middle class. You actually had funds, your own horse and the groomers and the equipment you needed to be that thing. So that's where it originally came from, but that meaning sort of gets lost during our period of time. They still get that name equestrian class, but really it's just all about the fact that they are the businessmen. They are the businessmen. Okay? Now, they play a really important function, obviously the key business things, but they're all over the empire because they're the people who run the tax collecting and in each of the provinces. And they basically, through their trade agreements throughout the empire, help hold the empire together. Now this group here, the plebs, basically they're just the working class. So they are the bottom group in society. Now they range from everything from the poorest to the poor to being some reasonably well-off working class group who is called the plebs. We often talk about them as being, the mob. A lot of people refer to them because they are this mob. A lot of them are unemployed. So I guess calling them working class isn't entirely true either. But they are just that lowest class in society. But even though they're the lowest class, there's one thing that they have which makes them more powerful and more important than anyone else outside. The fact that they've got this Roman citizenship. So the fact that they are Roman citizens, they have the vote. They can vote, and on top of that, they have the power to, besides being able to vote, they've got the ability to be given like the free corn, because often the consuls, the leaders of Rome, would put in place laws sort of giving, everybody was entitled to so many grams of free corn. And corn was what they made bread out of those days. So corn was what they ground down to make flour, to make bread. So, it was a pretty important thing. So there's a lot of benefits that came from it. They got their entry into the games and watching the gladiators and so on. So there's a pretty significant thing still being a play. Groups below, we call them freemen. Now, what do you reckon they are?
Slaves that are free.
It's ex-slaves, freemen. They're not citizens. So I guess we could say like this is the level of citizenship.
Can they ever become citizens?
Yeah, they can. After another generation or so, like their children, etc. Or run they can. But they're not citizens, but they've still got a lot of privileges. In Rome as being freedmen and so on. But they're definitely above the role of slaves. And slaves obviously don't have anything, they're not they have no rights. The slave owner can technically crucify his slaves for doing the wrong things. They can literally, put them up on a stake outside their house and crucify them if they're not happy with them. Now, that all seems pretty straightforward and easy, but a really complicated factor is we have in place, which particularly affects down in the middle here. We have also another breakdown. We call the plebeian E-I-A-N, the plebeian class, and we have the patricians. Plebeian and patricians.
Could freemen have slaves?
Big man?
Could freemen have slaves?
Yeah. Anyone can have a slave before the plebeian and patricians. It really only affects this sort of group from here upwards, really, because this group here is never going to be patricians. But when we go back to the ancient times of Rome, about 500 BC, when they actually had a king, there was a noble class, and the noble class was called the patricians. So they were the nobles. Okay, they were the nobles, they were the aristocrats, etc. But as time went on, and we get plebeians who aren't that aristocratic class getting quite powerful in terms of wealth and so on, they start demanding, once the kings are gone and it's a senate place, they start demanding that unless they're given the opportunity of actually being in the Senate and actually having all those top positions, then they're not just going to destroy the kings, because there was a revolution where the two kings where the king was pulled down, but they're going to pull down the aristocratic class as well. So the patricians have to sort of give into it. And what the patricians do is they do put in place a system where the plebeians are looked after. Plebeians can rise through the Senate. And they can get those top jobs. But what makes it complicated is we still often talk about these Roman senators from particular families, like the Julius family, Julius Caesar's, or the Cornelius families, or the Metelli, and so on. There's a couple of, about a dozen really famous families. They still think of themselves as being a bit better than anyone else because they can trace their family back to being patrician. So a patrician these days, if you talk about something being patrician, you're generally talking about just like upper class. Well, That's what it was back then. Even though the plebeians could rise their way through, the patricians just still had that little bit of a, snobbiness, extra thing. They could sort of say, our family goes back these hundreds of years as being, the ruling class of Rome. Alright, so that's how that works. So don't get it confused when we're talking about plebeians. We're just talking about the plebs. Because the plebs, is basically this working class, but we can also talk about people coming from the plebeian side of things. It is confusing